The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only constant sound in the vast, open-plan office, a sterile symphony of corporate efficiency. Sarah sat at her desk, a small island in a sea of identical cubicles, the glow of her computer screen reflecting in her tired eyes. Outside, the city moved at a relentless pace, but inside, time seemed to crawl, measured in keystrokes and the soft chime of incoming emails. She was a dedicated employee, meticulously organizing spreadsheets and answering calls with a professional warmth that belied the heavy weight on her shoulders. As a single mother, this job was more than a career. It was a lifeline, the fragile thread that held her world and her child's future together. Every task completed was a small victory against the tide of bills and worries that awaited her at home. The pressure had been mounting all week. A major deadline loomed, casting a palpable tension over the entire floor. Her supervisor, a man who valued metrics over morale, had made it clear that failure was not an option. Sarah could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She glanced at a small, framed photo on her desk, a smiling face with missing front teeth, her son, Leo. It was a beacon of light in this grey, impersonal world. It was for him that she pushed through the exhaustion, for him that she endured the cold indifference of her workplace. But in that moment, the weight felt unbearable. She needed a sliver of peace, a moment to reconnect with the source of her strength before she crumbled under the strain. With a quiet breath, Sarah pushed her chair back slightly, turning away from the glaring screen. She lowered her head, her hands folding gently in her lap. A silent, private ritual she had performed countless times. For 5 minutes, she closed her eyes and let the noise of the office fade into a distant murmur. In the sanctuary of her mind, she offered a simple, heartfelt prayer, not for a miracle or an escape, but for strength, for patience, and for the grace to face the day's challenges. It was a moment of profound stillness, a personal anchor in a turbulent sea. This brief communion was her secret weapon, the invisible shield that protected her spirit from the harshness of the world, allowing her to be the mother and provider Leo needed. The fragile peace was shattered by a sharp, condescending voice. "Miss Miller, what do you think you're doing?" Her supervisor, Mr. Harrison, stood over her, his arms crossed, his face a mask of disapproval. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. The entire section of the office had gone silent, the rhythm of typing replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. She felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, a wave of humiliation washing over her. She tried to explain that it was just a moment for herself, a way to refocus, but her words were cut short. "This is a place of business," he declared loudly, "not a place for personal rituals. This behavior is unprofessional and a clear violation of company productivity standards. Pack your things." The walk to the elevator felt like an eternity. A small cardboard box, holding the photo of Leo and a few personal trinkets, grew heavier with each step. The sympathetic but silent glances from her former colleagues offered no comfort. The gleaming elevator doors closed, reflecting her own stunned and heartbroken expression. Moments later, she was standing on the cold city street, the sounds of traffic a jarring contrast to the silence that now filled her future. The termination letter in her purse felt like a lead weight, pulling her down into a chasm of fear and uncertainty. She had been fired for her faith, for the one thing that gave her strength. Little did she know, this act of perceived injustice had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. The city air felt sharp and unforgiving against Sarah's tear-streaked cheeks as she walked numbly away from the towering glass building that had, until an hour ago, defined her existence. Each step on the cold pavement was a painful reminder of her new reality, jobless, singled out, and utterly alone. The weight of the small cardboard box in her arms seemed to grow heavier, not with the meager contents of her desk, but with the crushing burden of her future. How would she explain this to Leo? How would she afford the rent that was due in just over a week? The city's symphony of blaring horns and distant sirens mocked her internal silence, a chaotic soundtrack to the implosion of her world. She felt invisible, a ghost drifting through a crowd of people who were all heading somewhere, while her own path had just vanished into a fog of fear and uncertainty. She descended into the echoing cavern of the subway station, the stale air thick with the scent of hurried lives and damp concrete. Finding a seat on the rattling train, she stared blankly at her reflection in the darkened window, a pale, defeated version of the woman who had left for work that morning with quiet hope. Across the aisle, an elderly woman struggled to her feet as the train lurched towards a stop, her hands trembling as she tried to balance a worn grocery bag overflowing with produce. An apple broke free, rolling across the grimy floor and coming to a rest near Sarah's feet. For a moment, Sarah didn't move, paralyzed by her own grief. It would be so easy to ignore it, to let someone else help, to remain cocooned in the misery that felt like her only possession now. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, sharp with panic, urged her to stay seated, to conserve what little emotional energy she had left for the trials that awaited her at home. It told her she had earned the right to be selfish, that the world had just dealt her a cruel and unjust blow. Why should she extend a hand when no one had extended one to her? Helping this stranger was a distraction she couldn't afford. It was a delay in getting home to Leo, a delay in confronting the terrifying emptiness of her situation. She felt a powerful urge to just close her eyes, to retreat into the darkness and let the world, with all its small and large injustices, simply pass her by. Her own problems were a mountain. This woman's fallen apple was just a pebble, but then another voice, quieter and more persistent, broke through the noise of her despair. It was the voice of her faith, the very thing that had cost her everything, and yet it was the one thing she couldn't abandon. She looked at the woman's tired, wrinkled face and saw not a stranger, but a reflection of shared struggle, of quiet dignity in the face of life's daily burdens. In that instant, she knew she couldn't turn away. It wasn't a choice born of logic, but an instinct that came from the deepest part of her soul. Pushing her own pain aside, Sarah bent down, her movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the bruised apple from the floor. Her own world was in pieces, but here was one small piece of another's she could put back into place. Rising, she approached the elderly woman with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her own pained eyes. "I think you dropped this," she said softly, placing the apple back into the bag and helping to steady it. The woman's face crinkled into a look of profound gratitude, her frail hand briefly touching Sarah's arm in a silent, powerful gesture of thanks. The connection was fleeting, a tiny spark of warmth in the cold expanse of Sarah's day. After the woman departed at the next station, Sarah returned to her seat, the brief interaction leaving a strange sense of peace in its wake. As she reached into her coat pocket for a tissue, her fingers brushed against something small and metallic. It was a simple, silver locket, one she had never seen before, clearly left behind by the woman in their brief exchange. Back in the quiet solitude of her small apartment, the city's indifferent hum was replaced by the soft sounds of home, the ticking of a clock, the gentle breathing of her sleeping son in the next room. The cardboard box from her office sat unopened by the door, a monument to her failure. But in her hand, the silver locket felt warm and real, a tangible link to a moment of grace in a day of ruin. Curiosity wrestled with her exhaustion. With trembling fingers, she found the tiny clasp and eased it open. She expected to see a faded photograph, a miniature portrait of a loved one. Instead, nestled against the worn velvet lining, was a small, meticulously folded piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, she found not a note, but a simple address, handwritten in an elegant, old-fashioned script. It felt less like an accident and more like an invitation, a quiet whisper of destiny she couldn't ignore. The following morning, after a restless night spent staring at the ceiling, Sarah made a decision that defied all logic. Instead of scouring job listings or panicking over her dwindling bank account, she bundled Leo into his coat and took the bus to the address from the locket. They arrived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a world away from the steel and glass canyons of downtown. The building was a modest but dignified brownstone, with ivy climbing its walls and flower boxes, now dormant for the winter, beneath the windows. Holding Leo's small hand, she felt a profound sense of trepidation. This was foolish. She was chasing a ghost, intruding on a stranger's life based on a lost piece of jewelry. Yet, something propelled her forward. A feeling that this detour was not a distraction from her path, but the path itself. Taking a deep breath, she rang the bell. The door opened to reveal the same kind, wrinkled face from the subway. The woman's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in a dawning, radiant smile of recognition. "Oh, my dear child, you found me," she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine warmth. She ushered them inside, out of the biting wind, into an apartment that felt like a warm embrace. The air was rich with the scent of cinnamon and baking bread. Bookshelves overflowed, photographs of a life well lived covered every surface, and a gentle classical melody drifted from an old radio. The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor, seemed overjoyed not just by the Locketts' return, but by their presence. Leo, usually shy around strangers, seemed to sense the home's gentle spirit and was immediately captivated by a small wooden train set on a rug. As Leo played contentedly, Eleanor insisted Sarah stay for tea and a slice of warm apple cake. They sat at a small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. Eleanor spoke of her life, of her late husband, a man she described as brilliant and kind, but who had become lost in the world he had created. There was a deep well of sadness in her eyes when she mentioned her own son, from whom she was estranged. "He values his father's success," she said softly, her gaze distant. "But I fear he has forgotten his father's heart." She didn't elaborate, leaving a veil of mystery over the family's past. But Sarah felt an unspoken kinship with this woman, a shared understanding of loss and quiet strength. As it was time to leave, Eleanor wrapped a fresh loaf of bread in a cloth for them. At the door, she took both of Sarah's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly firm. Her gaze was intense, filled with a wisdom that seemed to see right into Sarah's soul. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Kindness is a currency that has become so rare in the empire my husband built." Sarah smiled, touched by the sentiment but slightly puzzled by the strange choice of words. She walked down the quiet street with Leo, the warmth of the bread seeping through the cloth, feeling a sense of peace she couldn't explain. But Eleanor's final phrase, "the empire my husband built," echoed in her mind, a curious and unsettling riddle she couldn't yet solve. The days following her encounter with Eleanor blurred into a monotonous cycle of anxiety and fruitless job searching. Sarah's small apartment, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing hour. The warmth of Eleanor's kindness was a fading memory, overshadowed by the stark reality of her situation. She would sit at her small kitchen table, Leo playing quietly on the floor, and stare at the list of bills, the numbers swimming before her eyes. The city outside, with its millions of stories, felt utterly indifferent to hers. She prayed not for a miracle, but for the resilience to keep fighting, to shield her son from the fear that gnawed at her heart. Her faith, which had once been a source of quiet strength, now felt like a heavy stone, the very thing that had dragged her under the water. Miles away, in a sterile office atop the city's tallest skyscraper, A man sat alone in the dark, the only light coming from a bank of glowing security monitors. This was Mr. Thompson, the CEO, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and unparalleled success. He was a ghost in his own empire, isolated by wealth and a grief he refused to acknowledge. He was conducting a routine late-night review of the day's security logs, a detached and impersonal process, when a minor HR incident flagged on one of the feeds caught his attention. He watched, his face impassive, as a supervisor berated a female employee. He saw her being dismissed, packing a small cardboard box. It was a mundane, unremarkable event in the life of a massive corporation, one he would normally ignore. But something made him pause. He rewound the footage, his finger hovering over the controls. He wasn't interested in the firing, but in the moments that preceded it. He zoomed in on the woman's desk, watching as she turned away from her computer, lowered her head, and closed her eyes. For 5 minutes, she sat in perfect stillness. The image was a jolt, a crack in the icy facade he had built around his heart. Suddenly, he was no longer in his office. He was in a sunlit hospital room years ago, watching his wife, Elizabeth, her face pale but serene, her hands folded in quiet prayer just before her final surgery. It was the same gesture, the same silent plea for strength against an overwhelming tide. It was the faith that had been the bedrock of their life together, the very soul of the company they had dreamed of building. The memory was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. After Elizabeth's death, he had entombed her memory, along with her faith, believing that sentimentality was a weakness his business could not afford. He transformed their shared dream into a cold, profit-driven machine, pushing away everyone who reminded him of what he had lost, including his own mother, Eleanor, who saw Elizabeth's spirit in every kind act he now disdained. He had inherited his father's ambition, but had discarded his wife's compassion. Sarah's quiet, dignified prayer on the security feed was not just an employee's action. It was a mirror reflecting the man he had become, a hollow shell, ruling over an empire without a soul. He saw the injustice not just of her firing, but of his own life's direction. A storm of emotion, shame, regret, and a profound, aching sorrow washed over him. He watched the rest of the footage, seeing Sarah's quiet dignity as she was escorted from the building, the photo of her son clutched in her box. He saw in her the same resilience, the same unwavering spirit that he had once loved and then abandoned. This woman, fired for an act of unprofessional faith, was more aligned with the company's founding values than he had been in years. A decision began to form in his mind. A desperate need to correct not just this one small injustice, but the great injustice he had done to Elizabeth's memory. But what he didn't know is that fate was about to reveal an even deeper connection, proving that the woman he had just wronged was the only person who could help him find his way back. The next morning arrived not with the promise of a new day, but as a grey continuation of the last. A sharp, insistent knock on the apartment door cut through the quiet despair, making Sarah's heart leap into her throat. She froze, her mind immediately picturing the landlord, his hand outstretched for the rent she didn't have. With Leo clinging to her leg, she moved cautiously towards the door, peering through the small peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a man she had never seen before, his figure sharp and imposing in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He looked profoundly out of place, a figure of wealth and power standing before her peeling paint and worn-out welcome mat. A wave of confusion washed over her fear. He wasn't the landlord. His face was etched with a tiredness that seemed to go deeper than mere exhaustion, a familiar sorrow she couldn't quite place. Taking a shallow, unsteady breath, she opened the door just a crack. The man did not speak immediately, his gaze meeting hers with an unnerving intensity. "Ms. Miller," he asked, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle, a stark contrast to his powerful demeanor. "My name is Thompson, Daniel Thompson." The name hung in the air, a familiar echo from the cold, impersonal termination letter now sitting on her kitchen table. Thompson, the name at the bottom of the letterhead, the invisible king of the corporate empire that had cast her out. The CEO. The shock was a physical force, stealing the air from her lungs and making the small hallway seem to tilt. He was here, not an HR representative, not a manager, but the man at the very top of the pyramid, standing on her doorstep as if he had been summoned from a different reality. He seemed to sense her reeling confusion and spoke again, his tone softening further. "May I come in for a moment? I promise I won't take much of your time." Numbly, she stepped back, allowing him to enter her small, humble living space. He moved with a quiet reverence, his presence filling the room. His expensive leather shoes were silent on her worn linoleum floor. His eyes took in the apartment, not with the disdain she might have expected, but with a searching, almost pained expression. They passed over the stacks of Leo's picture books, the slightly wilting plant on the windowsill, and finally came to rest on the small, framed photograph of her son that she had rescued from her desk. "I saw what happened yesterday," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "On the security feed, I saw your supervisor, and I saw you before that." Sarah's body tensed, bracing for an accusation, a final twist of the knife, but his next words were not what she expected. "I saw you praying," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. He turned his gaze from the photo to her, and for the first time she saw the profound grief that shadowed his eyes. "My late wife, Elizabeth, she used to do that. In moments of great pressure or great joy, she would find a quiet moment, just like you did. She believed that faith wasn't a weakness to be hidden, but the very source of our strength. It was the principle upon which we built the company together, a principle I'm afraid I have long since forgotten." He spoke of his wife with a raw, aching vulnerability that stripped away the title of CEO, leaving only a grieving husband in his place. In that instant, the entire narrative of Sarah's life shifted on its axis. The world she knew, a world of cruel supervisors, unjust dismissals, and overwhelming odds, dissolved, replaced by a reality far more complex and heartbreaking. This man wasn't here to admonish her or gloat over her misfortune. He was a man haunted by a memory, a ghost from his past that her simple, a private act of faith had unknowingly resurrected. The firing was not the end of her story, but a bizarre, painful, and utterly unforeseen beginning. She was no longer just a victim of corporate indifference. She had become an unwitting catalyst in the redemption story of the very man whose company had broken her. The floor beneath her feet felt unsteady, as if the foundation of her entire world had just crumbled to dust, leaving her suspended in a state of breathtaking disbelief. The initial shock that had rendered Sarah speechless began to recede, replaced by something colder and sharper. A slow-burning ember of humiliation ignited in the pit of her stomach. Mr. Thompson's confession, intended as a bridge of shared humanity, felt instead like an invasion. He hadn't just seen her prayer. He had watched her at her most vulnerable, her most broken moment. He had observed her dismissal, her quiet walk of shame, all from the detached safety of a control room. The immense power imbalance between them was no longer an abstract concept. It was a suffocating presence in her small living room. She was not a fellow soul he had connected with. She was a specimen, a piece of data on a security feed that happened to trigger a memory. The compassion in his eyes suddenly felt like pity, and her own story felt co-opted, reduced to a footnote in his tale of grief and corporate redemption. Her posture straightened, a subtle but significant shift from defeated victim to a woman reclaiming her narrative. She pulled her son, Leo, a little closer, a protective gesture that was as much for herself as it was for him. When she finally spoke, Her voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier tremor, and now coated in a layer of ice. "So you watched," she stated. The words, not a question but an accusation. "You sat there in your office, and you watched me get fired. You watched me pack up that little box with the only personal things I had, and you let me walk out into the street, not knowing how I was going to feed my son." The raw pain in her voice was palpable, a stark contrast to the CEO's carefully constructed narrative of shared values. This wasn't about his late wife or a forgotten principle. It was about her reality. The terror of the last 24 hours that he had observed but done nothing to prevent. Mr. Thompson was visibly taken aback, his prepared speech crumbling in the face of her quiet, dignified fury. He had anticipated tears of gratitude, a palpable sense of relief. He had come here to be a savior, to bestow an opportunity born from a moment of profound insight. He had not expected to be met with judgment, to be seen not as a bearer of hope, but as a passive observer of her suffering. "Ms. Miller, I didn't understand the full context until later that night. I had to be sure," he stammered, the words sounding weak and insufficient even to his own ears. He tried to speak again of the foundation, of the opportunity to lead a new charitable wing of the company, but the offer now felt like a clumsy, belated apology. He saw that he had made a grave error, viewing her as an instrument for his own atonement rather than a person deserving of immediate justice and respect. Sarah shook her head slowly, a single, silent tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She wiped it away with a fierce, quick motion, refusing to let him see her break. "I don't want to be your project, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and unyielding pride. "My faith, the moment you saw on that camera, and that's not for you to use. It's not something you can purchase to make your company feel better about itself. It's mine. It was the only thing I had left when your supervisor took everything else." The words landed with devastating precision, cutting through his good intentions and exposing the flawed, self-serving nature of his gesture. She was rejecting not just the job, but the very premise of his visit, refusing to allow her personal hardship to be sanitized and repurposed into a corporate feel-good story. He stood frozen in the center of her living room, a titan of industry rendered utterly powerless by a single mother's integrity. The grand vision he had constructed on his drive over had shattered into a million pieces at his feet. All he could see was the chasm of misunderstanding that lay between them, a gap created by his wealth, his grief, and his profound disconnect from the lives of the people he employed. Sarah's gaze was unwavering, her expression a heartbreaking mix of defiance and sorrow. She had been offered a lifeline, a way out of the darkness that threatened to consume her, and she had pushed it away. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy with the weight of what was lost and what could never be unsaid. Had her pride just cost her everything? Or had she just affirmed the one thing that was truly priceless? As her words settled in the deafening silence, Mr. Thompson felt the last vestiges of his corporate armor crumble away, leaving him exposed and utterly humbled. He finally understood the depth of his error. It was not just about the wrongful termination or the delayed response. It was about the profound arrogance of his mission. He had come to her apartment as a king, offering a pardon, expecting gratitude for a solution that served his own narrative of redemption. He saw now that he had viewed her suffering through the lens of his own grief, failing to truly see the woman standing before him, a person of immense integrity whose dignity he had nearly trampled. He looked at Leo, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes, and the true weight of his actions crashed down upon him. This wasn't a business problem to be solved. It was a human wound that required more than money or a job title to heal. With a slow, deliberate movement, he took a step forward, his hands open at his sides in a gesture of surrender. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped of all authority, containing only the raw texture of regret. "You are absolutely right," he said, his gaze unwavering and filled with a painful sincerity. "Every word you said is true. I watched you lose your livelihood, and I did nothing. I hid behind a screen, and I let my own pain make me a coward." He paused, letting the weight of his confession fill the small room. "I didn't come here today to offer you a job, Ms. Miller. I see that now. I came here to use your strength to fix my own weakness. I came here to help myself, not you. And for that, I am more sorry than I can possibly express. I failed you, and I failed the memory of my wife." The apology was not an excuse. It was a plea, a raw admission of his own moral bankruptcy. He then spoke of Elizabeth, not as the co-founder of an empire, but as the heart that had once given it life. He described how her death had created a vacuum that he had filled with ambition and cold, hard metrics, because it was less painful than facing the silence she had left behind. She believed that a person's spirit was the most valuable asset in any room, and I allowed my managers to treat it as a liability, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you on that screen, I saw the very light I had worked so hard to extinguish in my own company, in my own life. Your quiet courage, your refusal to break, it was a mirror, and I hated the man I saw reflected in it. You didn't just remind me of her faith, you reminded me of what I lost when I lost my own." A profound shift occurred in the small apartment. The tension did not simply break, it dissolved, replaced by a fragile, shared humanity. Sarah looked at this powerful man, now stripped of his pretense, and saw not an enemy, but a fellow soul adrift in grief. Her anger melted away, leaving behind a deep, aching empathy. She understood the fortress he had built around his heart because she lived in her own smaller version every single day. Leo, sensing the change in the emotional atmosphere, let go of his mother's leg and took a tentative step towards Mr. Thompson, holding up a small wooden toy car. It was an offering, a child's simple act of inclusion that bridged the chasm between them. Sarah finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. A silent act of forgiveness that spoke volumes more than words ever could. "Then help me," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he knelt down to Leo's level, accepting the toy car. He looked back up at Sarah, his eyes pleading, "Don't do it for me. Do it for the values we both seem to share. Help me build something that honors the spirit you carry, the spirit Elizabeth cherished. I'm not offering you a project. I'm asking for a partner. Let's make this right, together." A single tear traced a path down Sarah's cheek, but this time it was not a tear of sorrow or anger, but of overwhelming relief and dawning hope. In the warm afternoon light filtering through the window, she extended her hand, not to a CEO, but to a man who had finally found his way back. The world had taken everything from her, only to offer it all back in a way she could never have imagined. 6 months later, the world looked different, painted in hues of sunlight and warmth that Sarah had thought were lost to her forever. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights was replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves from the potted plants that filled her new office. This wasn't a cubicle in a sea of corporate grey, but the heart of the Elizabeth Thompson Foundation, a space vibrant with hope. Photographs of families they had helped lined the walls, their smiles a testament to the work being done. Sarah moved through the space not with the quiet anxiety of an employee, but with the serene confidence of a leader. Her desk was still adorned with the photo of Leo, but now it was surrounded by his colorful drawings, a constant reminder of the purpose that drove her. The fear of eviction was a distant echo, replaced by the profound peace of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. Daniel Thompson was a frequent visitor, though he never arrived with the imposing air of a CEO. He was just Daniel, a man slowly finding his way back to himself. He would often sit on the floor with Leo in the Foundation's small play area, his expensive suit jacket draped over a chair, as they built towering structures with wooden blocks. The deep lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He and Sarah spoke not as employer and employee, but as partners, their conversations flowing easily, filled with shared ideas and mutual respect. He had found in her not just a capable director for his late wife's legacy, but a friend who understood the language of loss and the healing power of faith. Through her, he was learning to see the world not as a series of transactions, but as a tapestry of human connections, each thread precious and vital. It is a profound truth of the human journey that our greatest blessings are often disguised as our heaviest burdens. For Sarah, the day she was fired was the day her world ended, a moment of profound injustice that threatened to swallow her whole. Yet, looking back, she could see the invisible hand that had guided her through the storm. Sometimes, the path we are on must crumble beneath our feet so that we can discover we were meant to fly. What had felt like a punishment was, in fact, a preparation, a painful, necessary test that forged her spirit for a purpose far greater than she could have ever imagined. The closed door of that corporate office was not a rejection, but a redirection, pushing her toward the one place her heart was truly needed, a place where her faith was not a liability, but the essential foundation for everything. The circle of healing was made complete by Eleanor, who now spent her afternoons volunteering at the Foundation, her eyes sparkling with a joy that had long been absent. She would watch her son, Daniel, laughing with Leo, and see the reflection of the kind, compassionate man she had raised. The man she feared was lost forever. She saw the legacy of her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, not as a cold monument of steel and glass, but as a living, breathing entity of kindness, nurtured by the very woman whose simple act of goodness had brought them all together. The locket, once a symbol of loss and a desperate hope for connection, now rested on Eleanor's dresser, a shining reminder that even in the anonymity of a crowded city, acts of compassion create ripples that can mend the most broken of families and restore the most fractured of souls. As the afternoon sun cast long, golden rays through the office window, it illuminated a simple, perfect moment. Sarah stood beside Daniel, watching as Eleanor read a story to Leo, their heads bent together in a picture of familial peace. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. This was the world after the storm, calm, bright, and filled with the promise of a new dawn. Life rarely provides a map, but sometimes, if we listen closely, a moment of prayer can become a compass, pointing us toward a home we never knew we were searching for. If this story of how a moment of despair was transformed into a lifetime of purpose has touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that their greatest chapter may begin on their most difficult day.